Moving on to item number 9, which is the submission to the Ministry of Transport on the proposed Clean Car and Clean Car Standard and Clean Car Discount policies. You will notice that Councillor Philippina and I have added some recommendations after we went through the agenda and read the submission. These seem to be really important to us to put in there, and we hope that they assist. So I'm going to hand over to the team to present on the submission. Thank you.
I forgot to press the button. Phil Hazelden, Manager Transport Strategy at Council here. On my extreme left, we've got Matthew Blakey from the Chief Sustainability Office, and to my left, Alistair Cribbins from my team, Transport Strategy. Alistair is going to take you through a short presentation just to highlight the key points of the submission and to give us a bit of context to how we've got here. And then we'll go for questions. So I'll hand over to Alistair now.
Thanks, Phil. Kia ora koutou. So here we go. We're here today to present on our proposed draft submission to the Ministry of Transport on 2 proposals that they've put out. Essentially, they're a package. One is a clean car standard. That is an emissions standard that would apply to vehicle suppliers and would require them to, over 5 years between 2021 and 2025, lower the average CO2 emissions of the vehicles that they're importing and selling. That's coupled with another proposal, which is a clean car discount, and this is more an incentive or disincentive for customers to try and encourage them to buy and reward them for buying more fuel-efficient vehicles. So this would provide a rebate to people that buy a low-emission vehicle and place a fee that's largely paid for by a fee on higher emitting vehicles. It's important to note that both of these proposals would only apply to vehicles new to New Zealand, so that's the first time they're sold in New Zealand, so all vehicles already in the country and the vehicles that are imported the second time they're sold, it wouldn't apply to them. So just to quickly reiterate and cover our Council's climate position, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but through our membership of C40, the Council is committed to limiting, or doing its part to limiting temperature rise to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Council also declared climate emergency in June recently, which really signalled that the Council recognised the urgency of the action that is required in relating to climate change. And also, we're in the middle of consultation on Te Taruki Tawhiri, Auckland's Climate Action Framework. In that framework, an important key move and action to highlight is Key Move 5, which is to deliver clean and safe and equitable transport options, and in particular, relating to these proposals, the action to encourage large-scale uptake of zero and lower emission vehicles. And I don't like to pick favourites or say one's more important than the other when it comes to these actions, but in this case, this is a very important action. As you'll see up there, on-road transport accounts for 37.6, almost 40% of Auckland's emissions, CO2 emissions, and around 80% of that 37.6, so around 30% of Auckland's emissions are light vehicles, which is what these proposals are related to. So it's the biggest chunk of emissions and really our biggest opportunity to address and reduce emissions. To achieve our C40 ACAF targets requires significant and immediate change, and you see here why. This is pretty small, but I'll try and explain it. Basically, New Zealand is behind the rest of the world, or at least other developed OECD countries, on our vehicle emissions. They're far higher than other countries. You can see New Zealand sort of up the top. I won't bother trying and pointing, but New Zealand's in red there up the top. As you can see, our average emissions for light vehicles are far higher than other similar countries. Those are showing solid lines, their current emission levels, and the dotted lines are future emission standards. So even if the government does pass this, we'll still be lagging. As you can see, the dotted line for New Zealand, that we'll still be higher than most other countries. So we are still, even though we have to make a significant change, and hopefully will, it will still only get us to around where many of those countries will be in a year or so's time. And it's important to note that as well, that the vehicle emission standard, we're one of only 3 developed countries in the world that doesn't have one of those at the moment. The other 2 are Australia, who are investigating one, and a bit of ahead of us investigating it, and Russia. So you can see up there are countries such as China, India, that have vehicle emission standards. So for this reason, these are really important proposals. While we did lead the development of ACAF, we can't implement it and deliver it alone. We require the help of a lot of other parties, obviously the public, private sector and central government. And this one is one of the actions where the actions of others are, and the support of others are really important, because we can't mandate vehicle emission standards, we can't introduce fees and rebates on vehicle sales. So this is a great opportunity to help deliver, act on this action and achieve this key move. Decisions made now will have a long-lasting impact. The lifespan of vehicles on average in New Zealand is 19 years. So on average, vehicles sold, during this time will continue to be in the fleet up until 2043. So the decisions we're making now, the government is making now, will have an impact in this sort of area for the next sort of 20 odd years. And also to achieve our 2030 targets, and to achieve our 2050 targets, we need to do a lot of action. We need immediate action now. To achieve those 2030 targets, this is really our opportunity in this area, because this is for 2021 to 2025. If we're making targets for 2027, we're not going, there's only 2-3 years before 2030. So this is a great opportunity, and that's how important it is. In summary, though, unfortunately, we don't consider the proposals go far enough to achieve the emissions reductions targets, and the government's consultation material essentially admits as much. This is the main graph and the main sort of information they provided in the consultation material. It's not terribly clear, but the blue line is the existing sort of path we're tracking for vehicle emissions or light vehicle emissions. The orange line is what they predict will happen with these proposals in place. And the black dotted line that's sort of going up is 2030, with the red horizontal dotted line, the Paris target. So you can see we won't, even with these proposals, and solely with these proposals, without doing anything else, achieve our, New Zealand won't achieve its 2030 Paris targets. We'll miss it by about 7 years. So our proposed submission, which is attached to the agenda report, is to support the introduction of these mechanisms. They are vital to achieving avoiding a climate emergency and to addressing climate change. However, we think they need to go further, either through amending these proposals to meet the targets that we need to for the 2030 Paris target, or else introduce other targets if the government doesn't consider they can change it significantly enough to introduce other mechanisms. We have recognised, it's not one of these bullet points up here, but we recognise in the report and in the submission that there are potential effects on low-income, vulnerable and other particular communities, as well as including rural communities. And we have advised or support continued awareness of this and some further work, as the government has flagged, on doing more detailed social impact assessments for Māori, vulnerable communities and rural communities who have less ability to purchase low emission vehicles. And I won't go through the others, but there are some specific points we have made up here and in a lot more in the submission, and replying to detailed questions from the government around particular aspects of the proposals. And yes, we're now happy to take questions.
Awesome, thank you. And if you have a look at the recommendations, that's where we've attempted to pick up those issues. So I've got Member Blair, Councillor Watson, Cooper and Walker, and then we'll pick up the others.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your report. I've got a few questions and a few building some context here too first, because I am quite concerned the impact on the low income and vulnerable communities. I'm concerned that we haven't done the work on that yet into the submission, and wondering why, because I know that Māori cannot afford even renting a home. They're living in their cars and now we're expecting them to buy an electric car to live in and impose, or if it's a second-hand car, impose another fee on them for buying a car that they can afford. Because I live in those communities, I travel in those communities, and I see it. They won't be the ones buying an electric Mercedes or a Tesla or a Volkswagen. It will be a second-hand carbon-emitting car. That's the reality. And I get that we do need the climate change, totally understand that, and to make movements into that progression. But I feel that the Māori communities are not represented in this submission strongly enough, or the low-income immigrant family, the low-income Pākehā family, the low-income Pacifica family, who live on the outskirts of the city to travel into work on an expensive public transport system. So I think I'm here today to represent those people, and disappointed that the work hasn't been done with the IMSB or the iwi to discuss about the social impacts on this submission, because I believe we do have the time. Like the petrol tax, it will hurt them. We've proven it, that is hurting the Māori and the low income and the outlying regions for the petrol tax, and we stood up against that. And today, I like the amendment within the resolutions to have this work done before the submission is sent to Parliament. Because if we don't put that in now, I think that there won't be an opportunity down the track in order for us to have our voice. I've got a couple of questions. First one is, why have you not done the work on the social impacts?
Two things there. One, we didn't have time. We had about 1 week from deciding, getting a steer that we should be submitting on this, through to having to have a draft agenda report and submission complete. So that wasn't enough time. There's also, we would rely, and especially in that time frame, quite heavily on the information provided by the government, and it is very high level. It doesn't go into specific types of population, types of population or specific geographic areas such as Auckland. It acknowledges that work needs to be done and says that they are doing it. The government says they are doing it. We want to be involved and have offered the services of REMU to help with that and be involved in that, and we just haven't had time, and we didn't have the information easily provided to us by the government as part of this package to do that.
Would you be open to the IMSB doing that work for you to supplement to your submission?
Can I just check, because I think we're sort of crossing things over a little bit. This is a submission to the Ministry of Transport on its proposal. Our job is to say we have two things. Number one, we support the direction because we need to meet our climate change targets. However, we've raised clearly in the submission that this will have impacts on our low income and disadvantaged communities. Therefore, let's continue with trying to clean up our carbon, but let's do a piece of work in detail and with thoughtfulness around the impact on those communities. That's for the government to come up with, and the mitigation package to deal with that. We can support, exactly as the team is saying, with our work with REMU, with the IMSB, but that work is to be done in conjunction with the government. This isn't what we would do in preparation for a submission. So I just think we need to separate those two strands, Member Blair, but no one's saying that work shouldn't be done. We want to see it strengthened, and that's what we're asking within the submission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I agree. I do think needs to be worded stronger about the impacts. That's all what I'm saying. From an Auckland perspective, where the most Māori live, the most Māori are at desperation in terms of lowest incomes. But I do respect what you say, Madam Chair. I've just got in statement 42. Can you qualify that statement for me, please? Because I have trouble linking what you've said there with any valid research, where reduced transport emissions will impact positively on Māori. Māori overrepresented in areas most vulnerable and least adaptable impacts of climate change. Additionally, Māori have high exposure to air pollutants and other ethnic groups. Is there any research done on that, or is that?
My understanding, those statements are based on a couple of papers prepared by, was it Rimu, Matthew, for supporting ACAF, the development of ACAF. One was an assessment of vulnerability to climate change in Auckland, prepared by a couple of council staff, and another one was the air quality and societal impacts from predicted climate change in Auckland report, and we'd be happy to share those with you if you'd like.
And because if it doesn't stack up, I'd like that removed out of the papers. But could you just tell me what impact our public transport and the fleet of Auckland Council's cars and also our CCOs have on what percentage it is of the submissions?
So through the chair, I'll take that question. So in terms of our public transport emissions, so in terms of predominantly our bus fleet, which is where the majority of those emissions come from, we know that as a proportion of our on-road emissions, they are relatively small. Around 80% of our on-road emissions are private vehicles and light vehicles, light commercial vehicles, that is. That's not to take away the significance of the emissions from buses. There are air quality impacts that are very significant, especially in our urban areas in the city centre, as a result of emissions from buses. But the answer to your question is proportionately our bus emissions, our public transport emissions are relatively small. We're talking less than 5% as a proportion of transport emissions, not as total as emissions. And then the second part of your question in terms of our vehicle fleet, so in terms of council's vehicle fleet, the fleet that we use, it will be small, and it will be included within that percentage of light commercial vehicles that we already measure. So I can look for the exact data on that, because we will have that as part of council's emissions inventory, and I can confirm that with you afterwards.
So Member Blair, recommendation C is that we continue to engage with the IMSB on the submission and to pick up particularly the concerns on the impacts of Māori and vulnerable communities. And I think hopefully that picks up that practical issue of how we go forward.
Thank you. My question goes to our targets for emissions and what percentage or what contribution the use of hybrid vehicles make by comparison to electric vehicles, and it, in some ways it reflects the concerns of Member Blair, in that they are obviously a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible and have immediate cost-saving advantages to purchasers. Now, while people can't afford 30 to 40 grand, you know, they can perhaps pick up a hybrid for, 7 or 8, and there's a chance the market falls even further. And obviously they could have that accessibility that Japanese imports did have originally. So how useful is the hybrid market then in meeting our, some of our targets?
Shall I have a quick first go at that? And one thing I possibly didn't make clear through the presentation is this isn't just about incentivising electric vehicles, it is low emission vehicles, and that is anything that falls under the sort of level that the government is setting, and that is obviously far lower than what our current average is, but it isn't just zero emission vehicles, as you say. Hybrids would be supported by the rebate, and that would be a very important part, especially for those types of vehicles where being purely electric may not be practical in the near future, and because it will be a bit cheaper. And I know Toyota have mainly focusing on hybrids rather than pure electric vehicles, and they've made a commitment by 2025 to have versions of all of their vehicles, including their utes and everything, at least hybrid, if not fully electric.
So has any sort of kind of thought gone into how in the short term that might be a far more manageable goal for significant sections of our community?
Yes, I think, because essentially this proposal, it's not just focused on zero, and that is why it is broader than just zero emission vehicles, because that is more achievable for many people, both cost-wise and practicality of how the vehicles can do. And there there are tables in the back of the consultation material that show all these vehicles, and yes, there's a substantial financial incentive to purchase those hybrids, not as much as an electric vehicle, because as I say, they last 19 years up to an average, so they will be having some emissions for a while, but it's a lot less than other ones. Yeah, definitely play a part.
We're happy to strengthen that though, Councillor, and make that really clear. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I probably more comment, but there will be some questions mixed in, and I do want to reflect on Member Blair's comments, because I know my struggle with voting for the petrol tax, because I knew it would affect my community, particularly as we're after South Auckland, the West has the highest deprivation index in some of my communities, and that's what really concerns me, is that this initiative, but one of the initiatives could be provide rapid transit in some of our areas we don't have it, and to provide either light rail, electric rail, or electric buses, and that's not happening, and that's why I voted for the petrol tax. And I'm really concerned around this, is this really going to, we say, oh, look, the trade-off is, well, we've got to do it, but our communities, and even a lot of our larger families are often the people that have the least money, and they need the diesel vans for their transport needs, and they have no public transport available. And we say expensive public transport, but some of them don't even have any access to good public transport, and they have to go far distances for work. And so that's my concern, is how, we've got that up there, but I don't know if it's going to be addressed by the government. That there's a lot of idealistic people that live in Wellington, and particularly in the Green Party, and go around on their electric bikes. That doesn't work for our low-income families. It's a bit pie in the sky. The reality is what hits, and they don't tell their MPs, they tell their councillors and their local board members. And when we are kind of complicit in that, that's what concerns me. So how is the government looking at this when it says, oh, well, you'll be a low emission vehicle? But I know that those new hybrids that Toyota are putting out are $48,000. And even with a discount, there's no families in my community in McLaren Park or Glen Eden that can afford one of those. They don't even fit their whole family in. So I guess, how are they addressing this, or are they kind of ignoring it? That's what I want to know. That's why I'm really struggling with this, Madam Chair. I know the bigger prize here, but we forget about the practical effects on the ground for our families.
I think, and this will be a recurring theme around the table, and as someone from the West, I've never bought a new car. I don't know anyone who's bought a new car. I've never gone to a car shop and driven a car off the showroom floor. People around this table probably have. I haven't, and neither do any of my neighbours. Can we just be clear on what the difference and the impact is on people like me who probably buy the car that I currently drive is fourth hand. It's a Japanese import. It is late 1990s, I think, or early 2000s. That's the average out west. So how will this impact me when I go for my next car versus the person who does go to the new car shop and buys a new car with choice?
That is, I guess, the point. It, in theory, shouldn't affect you buying your fourth-hand New Zealand vehicle. The difficulty is it's a little hard to predict exactly how the market will react if there are certain incentives and fees to new to New Zealand. So there is a little bit of uncertainty, but by and large it should have very minimal to no impact. There is a large market of existing New Zealand vehicles. There is the option to purchase those rather than buy a new to New Zealand vehicle. This probably will surprise many, and it's not to negate the impact on certain families that do have to buy larger vehicles that are higher emitting. But the analysis done does show that lower socioeconomic or poorer households do tend to buy lower emitting vehicles, and actually on average they will be better off. Now that is as an average of, say, the lowest 20% of earning families. that would include, for instance, a single mother or father with a child, maybe not earning a lot, but there will be a large proportion of our more vulnerable population who will, in communities, who will be able to actually will be better off from this, and also from ongoing fuel savings. That is not, though, to ignore the fact that it will impact some people. They do have options such as buying existing in New Zealand vehicles, and there are options there, and the government has tried to consider that. We do think, as we've said in the submission, there isn't more work that needs to be done, and we would like to work with the government, and we encourage them to look at doing that.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just
The point that we're
sorry.
making, and I'll come back to you, Councillor Cooper, the point we're making is it's the government that needs to come up with the package to address the gap, and we are not going to solve that around this table today. Back to you, Councillor Cooper.
It was just my concern around, if that's not enough, then does a tariff go on used imported cars? And that's the sorts of things that worry me, because it will be 10, 20 years before a lot of people can afford the second-hand electric vehicles. Because if you look on the market now, there's hardly anything apart from a little Nissan Leaf, and that don't fit a big family.
And that, at the risk of repeating myself, is exactly what recommendation C is about. I hope everyone just has a look at the recommendations. We're saying let's not let our concern for, let's not ignore the social impacts. Let's make that the centrepiece of what we want to talk about with government, but let's not, in the concern for that, lose the fact that we have some very serious climate change targets to meet. We need to do both. We can't do one or the other, because that's why we're in the shambles that we're in, because we've never addressed both sides of the problem. I've got Councillor Walker, Newman, Darby, Simpson, Collins and Lee.
So I've got a few questions, Madam Chair. The context is that I was probably one of the first adopters of a second-hand hybrid in New Zealand, and I've also been driving an electric car now for quite some time, and it's a second-hand one. So I know something about this, and I engage with people that I meet at charge facilities and so on throughout Auckland on an ongoing basis. I've got a few questions. First of all, why aren't we making our comments much stronger around our requirement to meet the Paris climate targets and the imperative for us, and it is an absolute imperative, around dealing with transport emissions? Why is that not stronger? Because I think it should be much stronger. So that's one question. The second question is, and it may go to a question that Councillor Newman might ask, and that is, why isn't there something in here about accelerated depreciation for electric vehicles? Because we know, particularly in Auckland, that significant imports are for company vehicles and for people, not necessarily in big business, but in small business, and that is huge, who have an ability to write off, if we call it that, some of that cost more effectively through accelerated depreciation. And of course we know that those vehicles go onto the second-hand market relatively quickly, often within 2 years, because the modelling around car sales indicates that. So I've got a question around why isn't that there, and can it be there? The other question I've got really goes to the point that Renata Blair made, and I endorse him completely. I led out the Council's low-carbon strategy in the first term of Council, and there was a specific need for an electric fleet strategy for Auckland, not just Council for Auckland, and I'd just like to know where the implementation strategy for that is at, because obviously that would be informing this process, so that's another question. And then the other matter, which also goes to the point that Mr. Member Blair made, is that given that electric vehicles require not just public charging, but also private charging, and there is a cost, I know, for some hundreds of dollars in putting that private charging facility in your home, And if it's going to work, it needs to be high amp, otherwise it takes forever. So why is there not some recognition of that? And that also goes to the issue of low economic households. And the other point that goes to that is that we know through earlier studies that these low economic households drive longer distances to go to work. They are going to need more charging stations if they're going to get around. They're actually going to need vehicles with higher battery capacity. What is the evidence around that? So what work have we done to actually support these statements? Because we know a lot of this stuff. We actually know it, and it's not in here. And it's of real concern. If we're going to make the difference in Auckland in meeting our strategies, it's the low-income households that are probably burning the most gas, many of them, because they don't have a choice. So how are we addressing that, and how is that reflected in our submission here? Because I don't see it.
Okay, let's get some answers for you, Councillor.
So some specific questions.
I'll try and work through those. I won't necessarily be able to answer all of them. Why is it not stronger? I think we thought it was strong enough, but that's why we're here today, to get your guidance on this, and we're happy and we would like to get your guidance on that and get the view of the committee. Around accelerated depreciation, I can't answer that immediately. I'd need to go and have a think about that. I'm not an expert on that side of things, so, and I don't know if anybody that was working on this was, so we're happy to have that discussion and consider whether we amend that in the submission. Electric fleet implementation, I might pass over to Matthew to try and answer that.
Through the Chair, to recognise your question there, in terms of the EV fleet for Auckland, in terms of Auckland Council and CTO's fleet, our in-house fleet is partly electric, and I understand there's plans for more of that fleet to become electric. Our fleet manager is looking at understanding the opportunities to do that. Obviously, the CapEx and OpEx considerations of our fleet have been taken into account, and I understand that our fleet is growing in terms of its the proportion of it that is electric.
My question was around an electric vehicle strategy for Auckland, not just Auckland Council. We don't have one right now, and I'm just questioning when we are going to have it.
Okay, apologies, I misunderstood your question. So I understand there is the development of an EV strategy being led by AT, but we would need to look into that further and get back to you with further detail on that. My understanding is currently there isn't one. There is, of course, the low emissions bus roadmap, which states that we procure only zero emission buses by 2025 with the aim that the fleet is fully electric by 2040. In answer to your fourth question around public charging and private charging, and to recognise and acknowledge your point there that this is actually something that Auckland Council could influence, and it's actually feedback we've received through the development of Auckland's Climate Action Framework in terms of the role of Council to encourage and perhaps even require either active or passive charging infrastructure, and by passive I mean infrastructure that is in place that can be easily and efficiently cost-effectively retrofitted in the future to install the appropriate charging infrastructure, to have a policy around that so that actually new development is future-proofed for EV charging infrastructure at a efficient cost. We haven't recognised that in our submission as it wasn't part of the request for information from government in terms of what we're looking to do. But we certainly recognise that there's three key barriers to EV uptake. One is range anxiety, the second one is the upfront capital cost, and the third one is the availability of charging infrastructure. So potentially Auckland Council has the levers to address that third one in terms of the availability of charging infrastructure. I would suggest range anxiety will resolve itself as technology advances, and then upfront capital cost is what this initiative is looking to address. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. A couple of questions and comments from me. I don't support the premise, the intent of the proposal. The proposed standard and the clean car discount is not one that I support because of the principle of achieving cost neutrality by imposing a fee on higher emissions vehicles so as to fund a discount for low emission vehicles. As I have understood it, having read the document, do we agree that that is the way in which the fee bait is going to be funded?
Yes, the government's pretty clear on that it will be a bit tricky every year to predict that exactly, but that is the idea, that is essentially self-funding with the fees offsetting the refunds.
Okay, so if we could just maybe just clarify my understanding of this so that you can confirm or disagree with me. Having read page 29 of the discussion document, it says, in an example schedule for new vehicles, the schedule has maximum fees of $3,000 for the first year. Then it goes on to say, for used vehicles, brackets, vehicles older than 3 years, close brackets, the example schedule has a maximum fees of $1,500 for the first year. So am I to understand that that is the schedule of fees that one is to expect on those categories of high emissions vehicles?
Yes, so sorry, I'm just checking looking at a couple of pages here. So yes, it would be a maximum fee of $3,000 for the highest emitting vehicles, on the highest emitting new vehicles, that is vehicles either brand new or under 3 years old when imported to New Zealand, and a maximum fee of $1,500 for vehicles that are imported and sold when they're older than 3 years old.
So can I just get clarification that for example, an $1,100 fee would apply for the category of, say, the Toyota Camry, which starts from a range of, say, $7,000 to $16,000 retailing, that you would have an $1,100 fee on a Toyota Camry potentially on top of the $7,000 purchase cost?
Sorry, I'm unclear. Where do you get the 1,100?
I'm referring to Appendix 5 in the discussion document. I'm looking at, for example, the Toyota Camry, range $7,000 to $16,000. The fee of $1,100 would apply for that category of vehicle in the document.
That's correct.
And so that particular fee would help to fund the potential discount for a $73,990 Hyundai, which would enjoy the discount of $8,000. I'm just referring to the Appendix 5 on page 43. Can you confirm that?
I'm unclear exactly how it would work. I would assume so, but I wouldn't be completely sure. I haven't looked into exactly how the government would play around with the money.
So I don't think that the Minister actually is presenting a potentially a good narrative here, because what this says to me is that this represents a very significant cost imposition on those people who will never afford a $74,000 Hyundai, but will scrape together the money to buy a $7,000 Camry. And $1,100 on top of a $7,000 Camry is a lot of money. And the principle of the poorest subsidising the discounts for those who can enjoy the privilege of a $74,000 Hyundai doesn't sit well with me. So have I understood the principle of that wealth transfer correctly?
At one level, yes, I think it probably is. There are alternatives to having to buy a Toyota Camry, as in you could buy a Holden Cruise, which would have zero, would not pay a fee, and I would, at a glance, think it is probably relatively a similar vehicle, and you could choose to purchase a lower emitting vehicle. But yes, if you choose to purchase a Toyota Camry, the fee you would pay would subsidise a lower emitting vehicle well, why wouldn't it's a specific one, whether it's a $74,000 one or another $7,000 car, but it would go towards that pool of money to support people buying those lower emitting vehicles.
Is it reasonable to assume that's one of the reasons why people might need a big Toyota Camry is because of a large family, and that large family might not necessarily squeeze into the little Mazda or a Nissan, which is a significantly smaller vehicle, or a little Suzuki Swift. So the issue here sometimes not only is cost, but it's the size of the family that needs to squeeze into the vehicle that drives the requirement for the purchase.
I mean, that's a fair point.
Okay, Chair, look, I can't support A because of the very statement in the first sentence of the first key point of the submission says that we strongly support the intent of the proposed Clean Car Standard and Clean Car Discount. And the issue there is that it is a fee bait. If there was no fee that had to be paid by the poorest people in our community who have limited choice, then maybe we could talk about that. But this is a wealth transfer. I get that we want to reduce emissions, but once again, I thought that a Labour government in the 80s got rid of tariffs, but we seem to be reintroducing them here. That we seem to be engaging in a great big wealth transfer that will be punitive on those who have the least means. And as Councillor Cooper said, even then, some of these families are living in communities that don't have alternate public transport options as an alternate to the Toyota Camry. So whilst I like the idea of reducing emissions, I don't like that cost that's being imposed on families that have the least. So I support the recommendations in red, but I oppose the fundamental principle of the wealth transfer. So when the vote is had, Chair, if my vote in opposition to the key principle of this submission could be reflected in A, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you. We've had a whirlwind tour of the wonderful opportunities of various models of Camrys to Swifts, and interestingly, they all had 5 seats. They're all the same size, 5 seats. They're just bigger or smaller vehicles. But look, probably a question here. Does this proposal ban any vehicles that are in the market already? Does it ban any vehicles in the market already?
No, not at all.
That's what I thought. Funny that. Will this incentivise, as you get the arrival of more efficient vehicles, will it incentivise the models that are already overseas but not in market because we have such lax standards? Will it incentivise the arrival of those models?
I would expect it to.
Will it also incentivise, as you provide incentives, and I used to be in the car business and I've seen the incentives from the 1990s, would it incentivise fleet replacement overall as you create this greater availability of the new vehicles, the new low standard, the new low emission standard vehicles, particularly, where buyers of those vehicles see an opportunity to replace their vehicle, and they put the replaced vehicle into the market. And there are more vehicles in market because there is an incentive up front. So is there likely to be more stock going into the second-hand market?
I don't think I couldn't say that agree or not with that with certainty. I'd probably be into your knowledge and experience in that car market area.
Well, look, I can tell you from history in the last 30 years, that's exactly what's happened. There is more stock in market for those that do need the vehicles that have been described here today. But just going to buses, I'm just wondering, one point I picked up here, this is CO2 focused. If you look at, say, the Queen Street Valley here, We've also got a nitrous oxide, sulfur oxide issue. Have we thought of, in our submission, making the point that this extends to some standards on nitrous and sulfur oxide emissions?
So through the chair, through our submission, we haven't addressed that specifically, partly because that wasn't the focus of the proposals from government in terms of the response they've requested. We are looking at, there's two policies proposed. One looking at introducing Euro 6 exhaust emissions standards for importing vehicles to mitigate the risk of an increase in diesel vehicles and a resultant deterioration in air quality. They are referred to as complementary initiatives in the proposal. So they're not core to the proposals, they are seen as complementary initiatives. We have referenced those in the submission. But that's the limit of our reference to it.
So I noted that point, and that was a good point to make. So we're urging in our submission to bring forward those complementary initiatives, including the Euro 6 standard, which has now been surpassed in Europe. You wouldn't go further than that. And just probably another question there, technicality. CO2 emissions from diesels are generally 15% lower than petrol-powered vehicles. So I think that's why I think we do need to reference the nitrous and the sulfur and elevate that in the discussion in our submission, because you could attract, you could incentivize the new HD diesel motors that are being released in Europe that are very efficient when it comes to CO2 outputs, but my understanding is they still have some of the heavy particulate outputs.
That's essentially the purpose of that complementary initiative. Is the government identified that as a gap, that by introducing this scheme it may actually incentivise diesel vehicles, and so that was them trying to address that. We'd be happy to take a steer from you and look at incorporating whether that should go further into the submission. At this stage we just accepted or supported what the government was proposing, but we'd be happy to consider that.
And last point, Chair, just in terms of the addition of e-buses, bikes and e-bikes, support that, but of course there's a whole new category, micro-mobility, which I think needs incentivising as well. Have you given any thought to bundling into that category micro-mobility?
Short answer, no.
Is it worth it, I think?
Okay. Nothing to lose. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are around the process, really. How is it good governance for us to support A when we haven't done the work to eliminate the risks and mitigations and deal with some of the amendments, i.e. C? That's my first question.
I guess if it's a governance question, that's probably me. So the point to make again is we are submitting to the government to say if we are to meet our climate change targets, as the council who declared a climate change emergency, we're supporting what the government is doing. We are, however, adding a very large caveat to say, because we need to get on and deal with our responsibility to the rest of the world to meet our Paris Agreement outcomes, we, however, need to make sure that we're not negatively impacting some of our most vulnerable communities. So in parallel, while we're supporting this work, can we please work on the kind of package that might be required to even this out for our vulnerable communities, to support their mobility and to support, and we will be raising this more clearly in the submission in conjunction with the work that we'll do with the IMSB, our far-flung poorest communities who have no other travel options other than to take cars. But what we're saying here is we're not going to sort this out right now. We're raising it as a critical issue to be sorted by the government as part of this process.
Okay, second question is around having the confidence that this submission is supported by Aucklanders. I note that we haven't received feedback from local boards and that is, if that comes, that is coming. If it comes by the 20th of August, it will be attached. So my question is, at the moment, I don't know if our local boards support this, and how, when I get that feedback, what confidence do I have that that feedback from local boards is not 5, 6, 7 people's perspective, but the perspective of the community that they represent?
We have had feedback from 3 local boards right now, not yours, unfortunately. It's all been positive to date.
My final question is that the climate action framework is still out for consultation. We're submitting before that consultation is finished. We don't know what Aucklanders will comment on that regarding the emissions targets, etc. Either, do we?
When's it finished?
So that's correct. The consultation is open until the 6th of September. In terms of your comment in terms of what Aucklanders think about the emissions reduction target, it's fair to say that we haven't received all that feedback to date. So we don't know what the end result will be of that consultation period. We do obviously have feedback to date, but I don't know if it's appropriate to share that at this point in time. But your point is recognised in terms of Aucklanders' view on those targets.
I made my comment, I'll just say I don't think this is good process and governance. I think there's a lot of work to be done before we put a submission in, and I know they've called for it, but I just don't think we've got the facts. We've got a very large risks and mitigation, of which 2 columns are bold, and I've never seen bold in the risk and mitigations section before, so I can't support this there. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, just reminding councillors, we have actually signed up, as New Zealand has signed up to 1.5 to achieve 1.5. As a council, 40% of our emissions are for cars and light vehicles. So this is actually the only way we're going to reach it, is by doing some large intervention. I just put that out there because it's a little bit like going on a diet and saying, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to lose 10 kgs, but I'm still going to eat chocolate cake and I'm still going to do everything because I actually don't really want to make any change. To be blunt, this is the stark reality of dealing with climate change. Something's got to change, but we have to put our arms around our vulnerable communities and make them our focus, because to be really clear, it's actually our vulnerable communities who are going to be at the forefront of impacts of climate change. I've got Councillor Collins, Councillor Lee, Councillor Walker.
Thanks, Chair. One question to you in a moment, and then a question, to the officers. In the submission on page 25 or page 3 of the submission, point 4 reads, because the changes needed to achieve emission targets may affect the most vulnerable cannot be a reason to not do what is needed. I didn't find a statement in the remainder of the document that talks about who maybe the wealthy emitters are and how they should be the reason that we take these positions. Do you stand by that part of the submission?
The intent of that paragraph was essentially to reiterate paragraph 3 above it, which was that we recognise that there could be impacts on the most vulnerable members of our society from the significant change required. We don't, as the Chair has said it a few times today, we can't prevent or let that hold us back from acting if we are to achieve our climate targets and avoid catastrophic climate change. But we need to do what we can to ensure that is mitigated or avoided. The design of a particular scheme may be unavoidable because we need to make such significant change. But in those cases, we then need to put other mechanisms, other support structures in place to ensure those effects on them are avoided or mitigated, if that makes sense. But we'd be happy if you don't think that is reflected in that sentence to look at amending that.
Yeah, and that would have been my only suggestion. Thanks, Chair, and thank you, because I understand what you're saying. I just think in the phraseology is probably needs some some work. Cool, thank you. And Chair, my question to you was, I like the stuff that's gone up in red, so to you and Councillor Alf, that's great. I'm just wondering if you see, if I could be a little bit, slightly push the margins a little bit, Chair, to see if you might consider this, is with the research work that's going to take place, I welcome that and your desire to work alongside IMSB, that I completely support. I get the impression, though, that there needs to be a somewhat socio-economic analysis, because I think the only real people who are going to get economic gain out of this, if the poor start buying these types of cars, are GE Finance and Instant Finance. And I just wonder if the analysis could include some kind of understanding as to our people who buy these kinds of cars, and I think they're buying newer cars that are smaller and don't emit as much, because you can have your loan approved in an hour that you won't be able to repay. So I know that might be pushing the margins just a little bit, but I think that needs to be a serious consideration if I'm to support this proposal.
I think, Councillor, I can absolutely answer. That's at the heart of this. So this is saying we cannot solve this in our submission. This is exactly the discussion that we need to be having with the government, is to say that, you know, and I will be blunt, let's not put our most vulnerable communities at risk and encourage them to buy, you know, belching, emitting, or let them buy belching, emitting cars that for the next generation will impact on their children, who are the most vulnerable. And we have research coming out of our ears about climate change as an exacerbator of deprivation. You know, read the literature. It is our poor people who will suffer, who are the least resilient to the impacts of climate change. However, saying we'll keep buying the crappy cars and we'll deal with that later is also not okay. So our strongest message to government via this submission is we support the change to the New Zealand vehicle fleet and the way that it is to be done. However, we won't see our poorest communities re-victimised in this process, and it is the finance companies, it is the loan sharks, it is the people that your people and Councillor Cooper's and mine and Councillor Filipaina's who are the most vulnerable in this. So that is absolutely the centrepiece of this for us, and that's the message that Councillor Filipaina gave when we talked about this most clearly. So you're not pushing the margins at all, you've summarised the issue.
I appreciate all the contributions of the members around the table. I think they've all, in their own way, been worthwhile and added value. I support the submission, and I support the intent behind the submission, while taking into account the matters raised by members. It's easy for me to support this, actually, because what we are doing here is calling on the government to take action, not actually ourselves, but in order, and that's appropriate, but in order to make our submission more meaningful, I think we need to demonstrate what we are doing in the work, the national effort to transition to lower emission light vehicles. It's a major transformation, it's historic, and it's very important, and we need to recognise that. It can't just be left to the government. We, the most populous part of the country, we also have to take a lead. And in terms of the transition to zero emission, presumably electric vehicles, we have to recognise that our infrastructure is totally inadequate to achieve the national goals. There, I understand, 23 rapid charging stations throughout the whole region, and I think 13 of those are free and the other 10 you have to pay. That's totally unrealistic, totally inadequate, and therefore we have to say this is part of our responsibility, and we're going to take a lead to support the government. That makes a much more compelling submission than just telling the government to do stuff or asking the government to do stuff. It's been pointed out by yourself, Madam Chair, that yes, we are making a submission to the government, to Parliament, and I raise again the question, the concern I've had about previous submissions to Parliament, to select committees, where people from all around New Zealand, elected representatives, sit and make decisions, that in our mihi, we don't have words like Auckland, the envy of thousands. Please, it's not a literal translation, to be honest, either. And it just gets up the noses of people who don't live in Auckland, that kind of boastful translation. It's not a direct translation. It's florid, unnecessary, what you would say in Māori, whakahihi. In other words, skiting. Let's show a little bit more humility if we want to get those good representatives, elected representatives from Southland and Canterbury and the Waikato and Taranaki and all over New Zealand on our side. Let's not stereotype ourselves as big-noting Aucklanders. I'll just make that point. It's a small point, but I think it's important. Thank you very much.
I think we may need to ask permission of the translators who translated this for us, but your point is made, Councillor. I've been a bit relaxed and we've allowed questions to morph into statements, so I'm just putting up, I'm happy to move the recommendations. Councillor Darby's happy to second. We've got Councillor Walker, Philipina and Cooper again, and I think we'll need to call it on Councillor Casey. If we can just be a little bit brief, because we thought we had lots of time for this meeting. We've now suddenly blown out our time frame. Councillor Walker.
Can we add replacement battery sets to what's available in terms of a subsidy? And the reason I mention that, you don't understand it until you've got an electric vehicle. The biggest expense is the battery. And if you're a poor person and you're buying a second-hand electric vehicle and the battery's already started losing its bars, if you're up for that expense, it's prohibitive. You're not going to be able to pay it.
Okay.
So my question is, can we add batteries to the list? And of course, this would be a new battery set.
Don't see why we couldn't, so more than happy to.
Good. Done. Noted. Good suggestion. Councillor Philipina.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to confirm, how much time were we given to put a submission through?
Essentially, we had, as officers or myself, 1 week to prepare this before the agenda sort of approval process started, and yeah, we have 1 more week before it closes on the 20th.
And what happens if we don't send a submission?
I mean, we wouldn't have an opportunity to have a say, really. Our view wouldn't be considered by the government.
And last question, the local board submissions that was raised earlier, and there were 3 local boards that have put a submission in. What are the 3 local boards' views on the submission who have taken the time to put their submission in, please?
I don't actually have copies in front of me. It was the Waihi Local Board, Waitemata and Great Barrier. The Great Barrier actually said it was an excellent submission. I remember that because I shared it amongst the team. The other 2 were very positive. There were no changes requested.
Chair, last question. Do you know why the other local boards have not put in a submission, or is there any reason or feedback that's come to the team?
It's only a timing constraint, I think, yeah, when meetings are happening. But the local board services have been great in getting it out there. So.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cooper.
Just a suggestion to add in at number 5 with the bullet points of additional recommendations was to rapidly accelerate construction of planned NZTA rapid transit networks. So that would lower emissions because it'd get people out of cars.
Yep.
If we could, because I think that's they've got them on their books and they're not doing them for 10 years.
Totally agree. Member Blair.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to ask Mr. Darby a question. Actually, just to remind him that car dealers are perhaps but consistently the most untrusted profession in New Zealand. I'm not saying that's Councillor Darby's fault, but I do note that as a statistic, and also to challenge him on a question: if he could find me a Māori whānau, a Samoan whānau, or a Tongan whānau that could actually fit into a Suzuki Swift, then including the Blairs, I would support your position. But that's just a bit of cheek to my friend over there. I'm just saying, Madam Chair, I can't support A. Because I think the fee-bait scheme does pinch from the poor to subsidise the wealthy. But I do note that, and I commend you and Councillor Filipina for the B, C, D and E, which I will support. But I don't expect my friend over there to answer the question in response. Remembering I'm an ex-teacher.
I'm a wee bit disappointed with some of the contributions today. We're on notice. On the 15th of June, we sat in this room for hours. We listened to presentation after presentation from the Auckland school strike, Generation Zero, the low carbon networks. We signed up unanimously to the resolution that we would take urgent action to address climate change. One of those resolutions was to take a leadership role. And I'll quote Sarah Thompson from the Low Carbon Network, and she said, and I've written it down as I did then, leadership is not about taking the path of least resistance, it is about taking a step in front. It wasn't a token gesture on the 15th of June. It was a call to arms. Are we going to walk the talk? Because this is the first hurdle. And from what I've heard today, there's some people not even going to jump over the first one. This is not anything we're doing, it's something we're asking the government to do, and they'll do it well. So, did you hear the submissions that were made to us that day when you voted to support? Or did you hear but you didn't listen? Because the message is clear. Do the right thing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I know where everyone's coming from, but I do get worried when we start to lump everyone into certain groups and use them as the scapegoat for our vote on things, and the way then we look at each other while we diss each other's contributions while we're trying to represent complex issues and our community. So, you know, it's a bit disappointing to see that kind of stuff coming up again. We voted unanimously or almost unanimously for a climate emergency. This is one of the first decisions we're making, and it seems on shaky ground. The only countries in the OECD that don't have emissions policy and policy around clean cars and electric vehicles are Russia, Australia, and New Zealand. So we are already way behind the pack. We have one of the oldest fleets in the world. I have concern that we do talk about Māori and Pacifica as if there's some people over there who don't maybe think or don't want action on climate change. You know, the strongest, most fiercest, most positive contributions I've had in my community here at this meeting, at workshops in Marae, are from especially young Māori and Pacifica people who want action on climate change. The other thing is that 75% of all cars are are already bought and sold each year from current registered cars. So we're talking about 20 to 25% of vehicle sales across New Zealand. The number of cars that and the government has done the work on this, and this is not our bill. And kudos to you guys for trying to put together as much as you could in a week. But this is not our policy or bill. We're putting in feedback, and I think as Auckland's biggest, New Zealand's biggest city, and an international city who are the biggest emitters, and the emissions are from vehicles, that if we don't put in a submission where, we're telling farmers and others what to do around the country all the time, and then we don't want to even stand up and look after our emissions. The government has done the figures on low-income households, and of the low-income households, only 15% of low-income households buy a car they're registering it for the first time in New Zealand. So more than 80% of low-income households who do buy a car each time is a currently registered car in New Zealand. This is also about trying to increase the number of cars, electric and fuel-efficient cars, to save people money by not spending money on petrol. Over 5 to 10 years, this will be saving $3 billion in fuel cost. The biggest, the low-income household, the 10 most popular cars bought by low-income households, by the data, 7 out of 10 of them will receive a large discount of those commonly bought cars. So, if we talk about Auckland Council, we've reduced our fleet in the last 3 years by 10%, the total fleet of cars, and we've added 20 or 30 new electric vehicles this term, which we should be heading much faster than that, but it's a start. Electric buses, Auckland Transport have said they're going to bring us that forward. I do worry that, we do say the right things, but then we're worried about actually making a decision. This is just a submission. We're not even forcing the hand. This also come from the Independent Climate Research and the Productivity Commission. This hasn't come from the government. This is not a government idea. They happen to be in government. This work actually started by the last Transport Minister, who was Simon Bridges, who was backing this and a whole range of other proposals around ACC levies and around registrations and making electric vehicles cheaper and other cars more expensive. This is a policy that was directed by the last government, actually, and this government's taking it up. Basically, it's not up to us to fix every issue within one issue. If there are issues around housing, costs, families, the government's doing that in other ways, whether it's raising the minimum wage, looking at the families package, working for families, the fact they're building far greater numbers of social housing, that this one bill can't address all the issues at once. The government needs to, and we've given submissions and thought on 1,000 other bills that have come across our table. I do not think it's perfect, and I do worry about the effects on our lower income communities, but it's not all of them that are being addressed, and this also may give the opportunity for lower income people to actually get a fuel efficient car if they want, and it's not all Lexus, Toyota Leafs and things like that are much, Nissan Leafs, sorry, and Toyota in the next 5 years are only going to be importing they're only going to be making fuel-efficient electric or hybrid vehicles. And most of our used vehicles come from Japan, who have had a policy like this for almost 10 years, who are only exporting these type of cars, which will receive the discount, and that's the majority of our fleet is used is from Japan. So I think it's easy to pick out one or two things and make it sound like the whole problem. But I think if we're not addressing climate change, then we're doing ourselves a disservice, but also the rest of our communities a disservice. So we can play politics and pick out one or two items, but it's up to the government to figure out how this happens. We should be supporting the general thrust because it is action on climate change and on vehicle emissions and on the fleets that we've asked them to do. They were supposedly told the public we're behind with the climate emergency and our climate action framework. So, yeah, I do get a bit worried about that we use a whole lot of different politics to put other lenses on this. I respect all of what you're saying on different things, and it's just disappointing when people from around this room have a say and we all get the pff and the jokes and the eyes and the barbs across the table. We're all actually representing different in all parts of Auckland, and I hope we can continue to respect each other. So, thanks.
Thank you. And that was going to be the final word, but the final word, Councillor Darby.
Thank you. I didn't want to speak just to say that I was never a car dealer, but I was never a car dealer, member Blair, but happy to speak to you about your next Camry, but not offer you a deal, okay? Look, when I look at our recent history of emissions standards in New Zealand, we have one of the worst, and we've been one of the worst first world countries for a long time. And our emissions since 1990, CO2 emissions, they've doubled since 1990. And I think they were around about 180 grams per kilometre. I think they might be somewhere between 170 and 180 at the moment, because there has been a bit of fleet renewal. We are currently, as of today, we are 50% worse than Europe. That is a mile away plus from being remotely efficient in terms of CO2 outputs. I also note that this is a transition. It's not like it's all going to happen in 2021. There is a transition period. And I think the part of our submission that is strongest is a signal to the government that it is a complete undershoot, that it does not allow us to get remotely near that 2030 target. And that is a failure of this bill to date. It needs significant strengthening, and our submission signals significant strengthening. 150 grams 2021, and then transitions to 105 in 2025. That transition period, that's what, 6 years away, 2025? That does give us and our communities a lot of notice and a lot of lead-in time to plan things so that they can look at what sort of vehicle they might be owning. And I do stress, and I know some don't want to hear it, but when you put incentives in place like this for fleet renewal, all those other cars that people are coming out of go onto the market, and they go onto the market at lower prices, and they become available. I've seen this on at least 3 occasions since the 1980s, when the second-hand imports came into the market. I'm not talking about efficient cars, I'm just talking about a lot of cars. So that's how the market responds. There will be more choice. And of course, nothing is being banned here. I would stress that I think our submission does pick up that there needs to be periodic adjustments to this. They shouldn't be through amendments to legislation or anything like that. It just needs to be some kind of system in place. I really do stress, Chair, and I thank you for your work, and I actually thank Councillor Casey for her words in opening this debate. And Councillor Richard Hills, I thought your words were just fantastic. I don't often say that about other speakers, you know, you sort of quietly acknowledge them, but they were good, positive, contributing words that needed to be said here today. We actually already have made a critical decision, and we need to start backing up, not walking away. But look at those nitrous and sulphur oxide measures. I would like to see something in the submission that addresses that. I'm happy to include micro-mobility as well. But if I can just finish, because I think Councillor Casey and Councillor Hills covered this ground. We committed to a climate emergency. We backed up with a climate action plan. I thought we were on a course. I didn't think we were trying to create a drive-through the climate emergency call, all through the climate action plan. Please, members, there's a lot to go here. We've actually asked the government to address some serious questions around inequity and inequality. Let's command that they address those concerns and support the submission. Let's back up our climate emergency call. It was unanimous, remember? So where is the leadership? Let's just follow through with that leadership.
Thank you, Councillor Darby. So I think what we'll do, I hear the call for people wanting to record their name against various bits and pieces of the recommendations. Perhaps we should put A separately. By division. Okay, let's put A by division, and then we can do B, C, D, E en bloc. So we're doing A, as long as everyone's clear what we're doing, and it's by division. Thanks, team.
We're voting on item 9, Resolution A. Councillor Hulse.
Aye.
Councillor Bartley.
Aye.
Member Blair.
Against.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Clow.
Yes.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Cooper. Councillor Darby.
For.
Councillor Filipina.
For.
Councillor Hills. Councillor Lee.
Aye.
Councillor Newman.
No.
Councillor Simpson. Councillor Stewart.
No.
Sir John Walker. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson.
Yep.
Is that everyone?
Yep. 12 to 5.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. And we will just, if people are comfortable doing the rest of the ones in red, I'll put those. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you. And, Councillor Simpson's against all of those?
Just E.
Okie doke. Right, I just do want to acknowledge our team. Yet again, the turnaround time for this is ridiculously quick, and they did it. We'll follow up and we'll pick up the issues. I've made a huge number of notes, and we'll work with the IMSB on the wider issues. We will just take a 5-minute adjournment. Thank you.